Okay, welcome everyone. Sorry, I've just gone live on the session. We are joined today in a talk on investment drivers of the South African industry by Frank Kilbourn and Pulane Kingston. Our talks program. Sorry, my name is James Say, not to be rude, the curator of the TAF Talks program for 2021. We are generously sponsored for the whole program and for the fair itself by iToo Art Insure. The tile you can see on screen will give you more details about iToo's insurance offering, everything from museum collections to private collections. You can find out more by clicking on the link. Our talk today is focused on a range of investment and market-related issues about the South African art industry. Our speakers, which we are privileged to have, are unique in their positioning in terms of these questions. Both are not only prominent entrepreneurs and business people, but also passionate art collectors in their own right. Frank Kilbourn is well known to the industry in South Africa as the executive chair of Strauss & Co. Fine Art Auctions since 2016. And Pulane Kingston, also well known as an entrepreneur and social activist. And both have prominent collections. Frank, a collection of modern and contemporary South African art. Pulane focused on the redress of the underrepresentation of African women in particular in her collecting activity. So both bring that wealth of experience and savvy to the range of questions that we are focused on today about how the South African art market is changing. South Africa has recently opened up to the rest of the African continent much more in terms of art collecting, art buying, and the market itself. That's changing some of the dynamics. The opening up of online art buying is another dynamic that's changing values and changing collecting trends. So those are some of the issues that both of our speakers are going to be ranging over today. Without further ado, I'd like to turn over first to Frank, secondly to Pulane in turn to address these issues for a few minutes. Then we'll open up the session to questions from the floor. Please type in your questions in the chat box, and I will redirect them at the end of the chat session as appropriate. And if anyone is wanting to access a recording of the session, it'll be available 24 hours after the conclusion of the session. And you can access it by sending an email request to me at the address I've just put into the chat, and I will provide you with a recording of the session. Without further ado, it's over to Frank Kilbourn. Sorry, Frank, for the second time, to kick us off. Thank you.
Thank you very much, James. It's nice to be on forum with Pulane, and welcome to everyone listening in this afternoon. I think it would be fair to say that the South African art scene has changed enormously in the last 10 to 15 years. Any form of change, one should perceive that in the context of what is happening to the whole art ecosystem in a country, in a continent across the world. We have, South African art lived in isolation for many years until the resistance art of the late 80s caught international attention, and some of our artists started becoming more well-known after a period of darkness, which sort of ended off with our last participation in those days in the Sao Paulo and Venice Biennales. And, you know, that during that time, people like Jane Alexander and Kentridge and Deborah Bell and a number of other South African artists took up the baton, and they became interesting to people internationally because of the issues that they were raising and the universality of those issues. Though they spoke very much about the domestic situation, there was lessons to be learned in everywhere. through the democratic South Africa changes and all of that, I think we were potentially at risk of losing some of that freshness in terms of world interest in our art. But we fortunately saw a very different scenario evolving, James. And I think if you look at the art ecosystem, we always had a lot of talent in South Africa, but there were not always opportunities for people to present their talent. And many artists were very well known in South Africa, but not known internationally at all. And you know how difficult it is for an artist to become internationally known, even with all the digital media at our disposal. So I think if you look at what happened, especially with our South African galleries, which the primary market and contemporary art, they managed to get, after quite a significant battle, to get into almost all the major art fairs in the world. And they took some of the most dynamic talent that we have in our country, and we put it into the international spotlight by presenting them at these art fairs. We also re-entered the Venice Biennale and other high-profile events. Some of South African artists were invited to Documenta and other such very important academic platforms where, if you want to be taken seriously, your artists need to be invited to those events. It was so nice 2 years ago. It feels like longer when we were at the last Venice Biennale, and there were these huge posters of Maholi everywhere up as one of the featured artists. Now, these sort of international presence that we get by attending and being visible at these events have been incredible in stimulating demand for our artists. We also then saw in the secondary market that where the auction houses play a role, that the auction houses have changed their content that they are presenting to the market very significantly in the last couple of years. We are all trying to reach out to newer and younger audiences, both in terms of people who are interested in purchasing art, but we're also introducing almost at every auction several new artists to the market. And it takes a while, we understand, for people to build up the sort of presence at the market where people are comfortable with the valuations and where they're comfortable about the future of these artists. But if you look at the catalog now and you look at the catalog of any of the leading auction houses 5 years ago, the content will look significantly different. I think the third major change that happened in South Africa was the deepening of the art institutions that we had through the creation of the Javid Art Center in Pretoria, the Mr. Shachat's initiative in Johannesburg, the Zeitz Museum, the Norval Foundation, and all these things. These are incredibly important structural changes to the art industry, where they give depth of research and you can present shows that are well curated and sought after and attract international attention. And then if you add to that, I think the very positive energy that was built into the 2 local art fairs, albeit it's very difficult to say it now when we had to move all digital. But we attracted audiences from across the world to come to South Africa, and we became an art destination. So I think the art ecosystem changed quite rapidly, and with that, we are much better, much more able to compete internationally and present our artists internationally. But on a more important level, if we just focus on the artists themselves, I think that many South African artists are addressing issues which are incredibly pertinent and relevant right now in the world. And they're not dealing with South African issues to a large extent. They might deal with the South African manifestation of internationally relevant issues. And there we are fortunate to have had a range of artists that were capable of not only holding their own, but leading some of those debates internationally. So I think we are making the right content in South Africa, if you want to be businesslike about it, which we are addressing the issues in a creatively energetic and new dimensional way, which people internationally would like to look at and see it, and they respect what our contemporary artists are doing. So I think that makes us relevant and wanted, and there's the demand for our work and for our contemporary artists' work. So with what we are seeing is that at the same time, people are asking what happened before all of this. And I can only talk from the secondary market point of view, where it's amazing for me to see the renewed interest of some of the older masters of South African art who maybe worked in the early and late 1900s, where they're almost like a coming out party. And our people like Eric Loubser, for example, that worked with themes that was addressed very much in Paris and so forth, but their recognition or their contribution to that debate was not really seen internationally. And all of a sudden, we see at auctions quite significant international demand for some of our artists that might have been forgotten from the international arena. So I think all of that is very positive. Another significantly positive development was the conversion last year of the art market from being purely analog and physical to digital. The fact that we now, almost 90% or 95% of all art sales in South Africa in the last 18 months have been digitally. So people have become used to assessing and valuing and purchasing artworks over the internet, which was really unheard of, or something we were very worried about early on. I think this year at Strauss & Company, we've had 2 online auctions per month for every single month since February. And they are, the sell-through rates are all in the high 70s. And so I'm very encouraged by the fact that people have adopted this way of consuming art and purchasing art, and they're still willing to allocate capital to art, which of course was the big concern that we had with everything that happened last year. As far as the African continent is concerned, there are various initiatives where we are trying, I think the market as a whole, to introduce African artists to the South African public, but also to introduce African artists to the rest of the world. Pulane, you travel more than I do, but I would, it's always interesting for me that I think 80% of top contemporary African artists still purchased outside of Africa. And that's really something that we would like to change, where we consume and value our own artists and, purchase their product and make people aware of the investment and over and above the creative and aesthetic joys of dealing with those works, but also understand that these artists are internationally rated and that it's a good investment to purchase these artworks. So there's a number of initiatives going. We still got a bit of a road to go, but I think we've made a very promising start. So I am extremely excited about the future of African and South African art.
Fabulous. Thank you, Frank. Pulane, over to you.
Thank you, Frank, and thank you, James. It's great to share a platform with you. I think you've made most of the many pertinent points. I think I'd like to just add a few. Obviously, we've seen a groundbreaking change in the art ecosystem in the last 26 years, and those changes continue. It's interesting that, or maybe not surprising, that post-1994, we are beginning to see the increasing prominence of Black artists and Black art. I think it's common cause that prior to 1994, art that was on the primary and secondary market was mainly not only modern art from the early 1900s, but obviously you had artists such as William Kentridge and so on that were more contemporary artists. I think we've also started to see heavily an increase in what we define as art. So it's not only painting that we're seeing a lot of installation art, sculptural art, we're seeing a lot of performance art making its way onto the market, and also a lot of technological art, which I must say I am still trying to wrap my brain around.
We've got a session on it later in the program, by the
way. Contemporary art is obviously on the increase, and we're seeing a lot of interesting art in that regard. Opening up to the rest of the continent, I think, is quite interesting. I'd say that relatively speaking, the Nigerian art market is growing. It's very exciting. 5 years ago, Lagos Art X started, which was a new art fair. It celebrated its 5th anniversary last year. And I do know that we had a representation of 2 of our galleries there, which was exciting. Because Nigerian art or West African art tends to be more modern in nature, not really conceptual, not really contemporary, I think it's interesting to see how the South African galleries that have been represented there and that have gone there repeatedly have also taken the time to work with Nigerian artists, to work with the other galleries, to work with the owner of that fair, in trying to get the market to start appreciating more contemporary art and more conceptual art and so on. It's also interesting to see that the one I suppose the most prominent of the auction houses in Nigeria, based in Lagos, has really shot the lights out just in terms of the interest in buying art on the secondary market, not only in Nigeria, but a great following in the UK, increasingly in the US as well as in Europe. So I think that's a very interesting development. We're seeing more and more art in South Africa coming from countries like Ghana, countries like Egypt. I just saw some work at the most recent art fair in Cape Town, virtual of course, where we saw the representation of artists from Egypt, from the Sudan, from East African countries, Lusophone countries, Cameroon, and that for me is really interesting. Not only that, by the way, but we're seeing more and more art from the rest of the continent in our auction catalogs. That's fascinating because one is then able to track particular artists over time. Ablade Glover being one of them, and I think Strauss has showcased a lot of his art. So one is beginning to recognize these artists who are also well recognized and appreciated in their own countries. I'll make two or three other points. The one relates to the fact that we're beginning to see in South Africa an increasing number of young collectors. And it's interesting to see that 2 weeks ago, we saw the launch of what's called the BMW Young Collectors Co., which effectively is trying to get younger collectors who are under the age of 40 to begin a journey of appreciating art in a manner that is not intimidating, in a manner that gets them talking in interesting environments and so on. I must say I felt like a foster because these young people are really young. The second last point I'd like to make has to do with the fact that it would appear that the African market, art market, is receiving significant global attention. And my concern remains about whether or not we will continue to see a sustained interest in African art or art from our continent, and also for us to start to think about the ways in which we will ensure the sustainability of this interest, whether on the primary market or on the secondary market. And then the last point, which we tend to skirt around, I think it's important to put on the table the fact that one of the reasons why we don't see many collectors that look like me, Black collectors, is because there remains a disproportionateness around people's income levels. The reality is that while we're seeing more and more Black artists come into the fore, we are also not seeing an increase in the number of Black collectors. So that's a piece of work that I think needs to be done. But to a degree, I understand why. There remain income differentials, but that doesn't mean that as our country develops and our economy grows, we shouldn't see a more balancing out of the buyers or collectors market.
Fabulous. Thank you very much, both of you, for that initial input. We've got no questions in the chat. Please, those attending, please feel free to put questions in the chat whenever. But I would like to just direct a few issues back to our speakers. The first thing is, which both of you have alluded to in your introductory remarks, is the kind of inequality or the disconnect between African art, including from South Africa, being produced on the continent and consumed in the major metropolitan markets in the US and the UK and Europe. And what I want to specifically allude to something you said, Pulane, to do with the perception of art from Africa as a flavor of the month, for want of a better phrase. And this debate is actually going on in the US, where African American artists have exploded onto the primary market and the auction market as expressing a range of relevant social issues in the wake of Me Too and Black Lives Matter. But there's a fear that there's a kind of a different type of exoticization of that art and a kind of ghettoization, if you like, of seeing it in the market as African American art. And of course, then there's the tension between art from Africa and African American art in that major market. Could you just give us your thoughts on those questions?
I think I'm going to let Pulane lead this one.
I think you've answered the question, James. There certainly is.
No, you're not getting off that easy. Come on.
There certainly is a continuing concern around the sustainability of the interest in African art from this continent. Black art is what I like to call it, because then it covers everything, and hopefully I'm not in trouble. But yes, as we are seeing more and more Black people and people of color becoming interested in art or having more disposable income, which enables them to start building collections. And in addition to that, as more and more people generally across the world become more aware of issues which pertain to the socio-economic dynamics of the world, whether expressed through the Black Lives Matter movement or in different ways, I think this art begins to articulate that, hence the interest in said art. So far, I'm not seeing a decrease or a decline in this form of art. In fact, I think that it is increasingly, it continues to hold art collectors' attention. I also observe that with a lot of Black art, we're still seeing a lot of figurative art, not so much conceptual art, not so much installation art, but mainly figurative. And I think there is an interest around that because Black people see themselves, and everyone else sees the issues of the day that Black people have had to contend with. And I suppose the fact of the matter is we're living in an era which is a melting pot of different things, where we are all beginning to question whether this global system, as we understand it, from a financial perspective, from a social-political perspective, is actually sustainable. And I do think that this particular form of artistic expression begins to reflect on those issues. So for so long as we're in this space where we are dreaming around or we're reflecting on the sort of world that we want to live in, and we're also reflecting on the living, the conditions in which marginalized people find themselves, we will continue to see an interest in this art. The issue for me, though, is not so much whether this art will cease to be interesting, but whether or not we will continue to see people buying it at the same rate. And I think that if you look at how art is bought internationally, it is normally the people of the country, the people of the region that buy their own art. And I think that that's one of the things that certainly COVID enabled us to do, which was to begin to look at and be alive to the art of more emerging artists, because we had more access to it online. So we all began to understand that there's a whole world out there outside of the white box, namely your traditional galleries. And I think it also gave confidence to younger emerging artists around the fact that we will look at their work, we will encourage them to carry on painting or producing the works that they are, such that we're prepared to fund some of this work. I discovered some fascinating artists during lockdown, and yes, I've started buying their art. All it means, though, is that it takes me a longer time because I actually want to look at the art. There is something about the tangibility and how you feel when you're looking at a work of art as opposed to the screen, which doesn't really, for me at least, give me a proper sense of and a feeling for what it is that I'm engaging with. So I suppose all in all, I'd say I'm confident about the continued interest and sustainability of interest in art from our region and regions. But by the same token, I am concerned about that income inequality that I think will inevitably hamper the growth and support for these artists.
Great.
Yeah, I agree with Pulane. I think if you look at the art world is just like any other market. It's not linear, and sometimes it reacts to a particular stimulus at a point in time. And I think all the issues that you raised, James, is a very positive sort of momentum giver for African art, because we address issues that are now extremely pertinent across the world. And as a result of that, you could also see artists are coming to the fore, and people are sometimes paying, quite significantly higher prices than they were willing to pay for the same artist 6 months or 12 months ago, because there's a happy coincidence between the message the artist is saying with the prevailing mood and that could naturally lead one to think, oh, okay, but if things change, would they still be relevant? I think I'm not that concerned about it, because as long as the quality is there, there is an enduring value, a certain pricelessness to high quality artworks. Sometimes they are slightly more valued than others, but there's an enduring value in there. So I think as long as we keep on engaging with the subject matter of the time in a high quality way, and the institutions supporting that thing commits capital and energy and time to educating people and do all the things, I think it can last for quite a significant period of time. It, of course, it's very difficult, I think, to be a professional artist nowadays, because, once you become famous quite early on, to remain professional and to remain focused and disciplined is difficult, because it's a tough job to get there. And I think it's going to pose some challenges in terms of, and that is really the job of the gallerist infrastructure, to make sure that people remain very professional and capitalize, because we have a unique opportunity as African artists to capitalize on this properly. And I think there people are going to have to show some leadership. And the people like Alan Tsui, who's almost like the king of African art, and Kentridge and all those very well-known artists will have to play a role in guiding people along how to deal with fame and exposure, and how to build a long-term professional career out of this. What we can do at the secondary market is to give sustained exposure to these people, educate the market about it, and bring them to the market in a very calculated and careful manner, so that we don't have this thing where somebody sells on 200,000 and 6 months from now and we can't sell it for 50,000. That's not good for anyone. So traversing this space will take some leadership, but I think it's a very positive opportunity for us, and we need to grab it. As far as Pulane is concerned, and if we blunt about it, we have to say, so what is happening with the black market in South Africa in terms of the purchasing of art? Because it is partly in terms of the broadness of the base, Pulane is of course 100% correct, that capital formation in certain parts of our sector, of our country, there's been 100 years of that, or 50 years, or 30 years, whereas black capital formation has had a lot shorter history. So clearly that plays a role. And then obviously how important it is. And I'm so glad that BMW gets involved, because I would say 80% the most expensive cars in South Africa still get sold to the very people we want to buy art. And we need to get into the thing that purchasing art and supporting artists and paying R1 million for an artist's work is as, what shall I say, is as life affirming as purchasing a big Range Rover, because that's really what I think we are competing against. We are competing for disposable income in the art sector. We are competing against other forms of luxury and how people manifest their upward mobility. And we need to make art cool. We must make it lacquer to purchase it. It must make it aspirational to have it. And so I think we've got quite a bit of work to do on that score still, I would think. But it's interesting for me with all of this happening. You saw that someone like Benny Wanwo's work, doubled, quadrupled in value in the last 18 months. So it's not just artists dealing with the issues now. People start looking beyond it and they start purchasing, the people that came before them. We've seen at auction a very strong interest in Pemba's work. We see a strong interest in we've recently had a new record for Kumalo's work. And I think there are lots of positive dynamic changes, Pulane, happening, which is not always that necessarily that apparent. But it's important that we make them sustainable and that we keep on putting energy and capital and visionary marketing and things behind them to make sure that they remain in the forefront and in the place that we've worked hard to get to and we should now maintain.
Yeah.
There's a couple of points that I want to put out to you both. But coming out of what you're saying, Frank, the roles currently, and the market is changing, partly under pressure not under pressure, but partly because of the online modality. There's a market purely in online that is now opening mostly to younger collectors who are not that concerned with seeing the tangible work in the flesh, and are more conversant with the online space and commerce in that space. But also the dynamics of the marketplace in terms of the boundaries between the primary and secondary markets are shifting. Where you've got artists opening up gallery spaces and taking control of that part of their market and their interface with their buying publics, which traditionally was held, that relationship was held by the galleries who represented the artists who got on with doing their work. So there's artists extending into that space, and also auction houses are moving more into private selling, and often private selling out of basically straight off of gallery floors. So those are kind of dynamics that are quite fluid at the moment. And Frank, it's a point that you made about how the secondary market is really a kind of custodian of value, not only for posterity, and you talk about the upside for Kumalo and Pemba, for example. There's a massive upside because those artists were never, given the proper academic and critical framework to provide and access to networks to provide their work with that value in the first place. Now that they're collectible and they're part of a changing South African canon of work, that upside is still there in terms of their value. So that role that the secondary market has traditionally played to provide that framework and that critical apparatus to secure an artist's value, if you like, is that under pressure because of these changes in market dynamics? How do you see it?
Well, there are a number of questions sort of embedded in your comments there, James. But clearly, the art market is a very dynamic space, and one would be, amiss if you think it's, the old boundaries of what is primary, secondary, the role of art and things will stay the same all the time. And with digitalization, we are seeing a lot of artists, going on their own and creating their own sites and doing everything by themselves. And I mean, we've had art in South Africa. I think Paul de Tooy and Richard Scott. There's a lot of guys who've always been side-skipped the sort of official channels and did everything themselves. And I think it's one of the exciting features of where you're going to. In the end, what can we do, say, in the secondary market? And you've summarized it very well. We are the custodians of value. We have to be very careful how we go about things because, just make short-term money. You can burn an artist's reputation quite easily because, what you take in, if you have a lot of unsolds of a particular artist, it's really bad for that artist's career. People look up to the auction houses. So we have to be very diligent and what we're doing. So obviously there's always a level of conflict between us and the gallerists in a way, because I mean they sell the first time the artist's work and they want to move it up and more expensive. We sell it subsequently, and the people that we sell it on behalf are not always necessarily selling at leisure. They're sometimes selling under pressure. And as much as because we've got a benevolent self-interest, the higher the value is, the more commission we make. So, but at the same time, we have a responsibility not to ruin the market. So it is quite a delicate position to manage. And at Strauss & Company, we do not deal with artists directly. We will, unless we do it for charitable purposes. So if we've sold a lot of art for recently for Archbishop Tutu's foundation, but we all sort from artists. So that we will do. But otherwise, we think that we are not well positioned to guide an artist through their artistic career. We are not geared for that. That is what the gallery space, whether it is, the artist takes it upon himself and form a group of friends or advisors, or the formal gallery structure, that's what they're going to do. And I'm not so keen to venture into that. Of course, there are serious examples now where galleries are doing exactly, and that they're moving into the auction space, and auction houses are moving into the gallerist space. I think what we would like to do as the market leaders, I'd hope to say, is that we should be very careful and very responsible in what we do. We can't start something and then just drop it. If we do something, we have to see it through. So that's why we're very involved in sponsoring the Emergent Artist Prize for, we're working with galleries across Africa to promote artists that way. We work with the Bag Factory. We have the Casino Wells Award. So we slowly but surely everywhere building long-term institutions that we support, latitudes, bringing those people to the market, educating the market. So we're not going to enter something lightly and leave. And as much as the temptation is there sometimes to deal with some of these artists that are highly saleable, we're always going to be fairly circumspect about it. But that's not to say that other auction houses see it the same way. The last thing that I would like to say on this space is we saw last year the collaboration between some of the major galleries in New York specifically, teaming up with auction houses on specific sales. So that is sort of an interesting dynamic, and yeah, we're busy getting our mind around that. At the moment, we're selling approximately 40% more artworks than we did 2 years ago. And that is enough of a challenge anyway, because it's very important at Strauss that we sell a work for 20 million, but also for 10,000 Rand, so that to make art accessible for people also financially. So we're very aware of the fact that we have a duty out there. Even if we make no real contribution from that, it is important that we are seen as a place which is democratized, where you don't have to be really wealthy to become an art collector. You don't have to be, in your 50s to become an art. You can become an art collector in your 20s and 30s. And, we really have a duty to keep art accessible to as many people as we can through both information and through the pricing and what we offer them.
I think if I may, I think you make a very, very important point about auction houses being custodians of value. And I think about that in particular in the context of collecting, both from a primary market and a secondary market perspective. I know that we spoke about how more and more art is being sold online. And in that context, I'm very, very conscious of artists reaching the pinnacle of their career very quickly, because what tends to happen is as quickly as they've gotten there, they fall. And one of the things I think collectors need to be thinking about is whether or not it is appropriate to buy art directly from artists, as opposed to through a gallery or through the secondary market, where value is determined in a manner that is understood. Because otherwise you find some artists who are independent of galleries overpricing their work, but in the same vein also underpricing their work. So we just need to, I think it's important to find that correct balance.
Yeah.
We have a I guess related question from our audience. which Frank, you should tackle first, I think, but I'm sure Pulane has opinions on this topic. It relates to how auction houses approach royalties to the artist in the secondary market. It's a bit of a minefield, but Frank, over to you.
Yeah, it is a bit potentially of a minefield, but if you look at it carefully, so and the argument for the royalties is that the artist has created this work, and then every time it's sold, it should generate some income to the artist or the artist foundation. But and it sounds laudable, but it's an incredibly difficult administrative task to fulfill. I mean, I checked before this meeting today, just under category A and B on the Strauss list on artists that we have dealt with on auction, there are 154 artists. Just A and B, never mind the rest of the alphabet. Now multiply that by 13 and try and manage the administrative nightmare of doing that. The second thing is, are these royalties only applying if the purchaser who bought it sold it for more than when they paid for it? What happens if they make a loss? So are the gains and the losses shared, or only the thing? So philosophically, I'm not too sure whether I am comfortable with that. And now I always explain it to my friends, because as you know, I am a rather enthusiastic collector, and I am fortunate to count a number of artists as my friends, is that we are doing a lot of work to maintain their value, to educate the public about the importance of their work, and we underscore the value. So as long as they are producing, they're going to have the benefit from what we're doing in the secondary market, both by protecting the value of their work and by over time, hopefully moving the value up. So there is a lot of value being gained. It's just not maybe a rand and cent on that note. But yeah, so if it was extremely easy and those sort of things, we can do it. But I'm still feel I think I've got a moral problem with the fact that we only share, that you share both, whether a person took the risk of made money or lost money on an artwork, and it's irrelevant in the conversation. And secondly, we really don't have the capacity to deal with the administrative mess this is going to cause, and it's going to detract all of us from trying to solve in some court case for 427 rand about having paid the widow rather than the ex-wife. I really, I'm somehow sympathetic to it. I understand the thing, but I think there are a lot of other ways we can add value to make up for that. You want controversial? That's my view.
Pulane, any thoughts on this question?
Nope.
I just want to say,
I think it's very, very complicated, and I must say that I tend to agree with Frank. It's just I can't even begin to think about the administrative support that would be required to effect this, which almost then negates the whole idea of a royalty. The cost thereof, from my perspective, is enough of a deterrent to want to go down that route, let alone the philosophical argument, which is to say, at which point, so you create the art, is it the intention that every single time this work of art comes onto the secondary market, you will enjoy some sort of royalty? It's very different, I think, from the music industry, which is where royalties tend to happen, or the film industry. It's just philosophically it doesn't really work for me.
And also I can add to that, Pulane, when you sell your music to the radio, that's where you make money. You get an annuity income from that thing, it being played. You don't get a huge amount of money up front. But in the art world, you can get a substantial amount of money up front for that thing. And it's also ways the boundaries of ownership. I mean, the copyright belongs to the artist anyway. There are limitations on what you can do with it. But I don't even want to begin to think 14,000 forms to fill in per year. It's going to cut the number of artists we're willing to deal with very substantially and defeat the very object in terms of accessibility that we are trying to do. I just don't think it's practical.
So, I mean, if I can chip in on this question, because it was part of my remit when I was in the auction industry. It's very interesting because elsewhere in the world, all of the administration of these royalty claims is done by usually a public sector agency, a rights agency of some kind. Now, the legislation in South Africa doesn't allow for that, but partly that's because the legislation has been dragging through the legislature for so long. But also, it's geared exactly as you both pointed out to reproducible art forms, like music and books or scripts, screenplays. And the reproducibility of those is the key factor.
Exactly.
Where with artworks, it's there, to use a term that's very much on trend, they're fungible. So you've got fungibility with individual artworks as a unique object. That how do you deal with that when there's resale possibilities? And elsewhere in France, which caused the problem because they were the first country to institute artist resale rights for fine art. They put almost a statute of limitations on resale. So there was a certain amount of time had to elapse before you would attract royalties on an artwork that was returning to the market. So that's perhaps one way around it. I see we've got just on this topic, we've got a comment in the chat from Moachi that says, which I've just alluded to, NFTs are trying to solve the royalty problem, but the challenge is incorporating the physical artwork into the NFT ecosystem. So, that's interesting. We do have, thank you for that comment, Moachi. We do have a session on this later in the Talks program, where one of the panelists is a gallerist who is the first one in South Africa to sell an NFT artwork, which happened about 6 weeks ago. So that's an interesting development in this question, the royalties question.
But the moment you deal with NFTs, James, you move much closer to the music and that sort of situation, because you can have 25 owners, each enjoying full use of that subject because it's digitally consumed, which is very different from artwork, which somebody insures, looks after, protects. It's because you become the custodian of an artwork. It comes with a lot of responsibility, that you want to encourage people to assume that responsibility. So I think NFTs will open this space, and I mean it's something that we look at very carefully, on how we should engage with it, and we spending quite a bit of time on it. So, but I think it's a different. The underlying asset is very, very different.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, to me, it's about the reproducibility of those other royalty attracting art forms. That isn't the case in fine art. Okay. Are there any other questions coming from our attendees today? Just give people a moment to see if we're going to take questions from the floor. Please feel free. Seems like everyone is happy with our input for the day. So I think we can draw the session to a close. I'd like to thank Frank and Pulane for their wonderful input today, for taking the time out of their busy schedules to clock in on a Saturday as well. And we hope you all enjoyed the session today. Don't forget, those who want to receive a recording of the session, I've put the relevant email address in the chat, and you can access it in 24 hours just by requesting a link via that email. Thank you, everyone, for attending, and thanks again to Frank and Pulane for that wonderful session.
Thank you, James. Our pleasure.
Thanks.
Ciao.
Goodbye, everyone.